So what we're gonna do is we're gonna watch a video, and in it, I'm gonna throw a bit of African history. But first, we have to look at something called the Islamic Golden Age, and the reason why is because, as it relates to African history, it's a very important part of African history when it comes, especially to things like the Swahili Coast, Mali, Songhai, and so many other African kingdoms, especially when you go from around 1000 AD onwards.
A claim often made by Muslim activists is that the Islamic world made a great contribution to philosophy and science. This contribution is often referred to as the Golden Age of Islamic science, and it is sometimes even claimed to have triggered the European Renaissance and even the European Enlightenment.
So lie number one is this thing calling it the Islamic Golden Age of Science. It's not called the Islamic Golden Age of Science. It's called the Islamic Golden Age. And this is because in several fields, it was doing it. It's like saying right now, it's the American Golden Age of Science. No, it's the American Golden Age right now. Now, of course, some people dispute this word Golden Age because it makes it sound like, you know, the Islamic world will never again create anything like this. And that was just the previous time that existed, and it was a golden age, and that's it. But, we're going to use this word Islamic Golden Age, no matter how people interpret it.
This video will discuss the Golden Age of Islamic science, the role of people such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, their influence on European thinking, and the extent to which this influence is thanks to Islam or despite of Islam.
So there's something somewhat suspicious about the way he said it, that despite of Islam is something that is pushed by some Iranians, especially those who are anti-Islamic. And so it's very possible that the guy who's talking is Iranian.
So you were only 1,322 years off. Not bad? Not bad start there. Talking of maths, by the way, a man named Al-Khwarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who came up with not just algebra, but algorithms. Without algorithms, you wouldn't have laptops. Without laptops, Daniel Johnson tonight wouldn't have been able to print out his speech in which he came to berate us Muslims for holding back the advance and intellectual achievements of the West, which all happened without any contribution from anyone else other than the Judeo-Christian people of Europe. In fact...
So, of course, that's the Western point of view. This is not a real picture of Al-Khwarizmi, as you'll see a lot of people get just given any portrait or drawing of them. And so, yes, he contributed a lot to maths and science, but we'll get back to how he was Muslim, or whether or not he was Muslim, and how he lived and all of that, because that's going to come into question.
Daniel David Levering, the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning historian and author of The Golden Crucible, points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe.
That is an absolute fact, and we know that's a fact because of several things. One, the blatant copying of Islamic texts within Europe, and the transfer or translation of Islamic texts like the canon of medicine.
Now, this is the type of energetic rhetoric that comes across as very convincing and is often taken at face value by us Westerners. Younger people in Western Europe sometimes even embrace this type of rhetoric as an expression of moral virtue, and as if it were some sign of allowing some oppressed group to finally emancipate itself. But is what Mehdi Hasan is saying here actually true? Let's dig into it.
So, of course, I've said it before and I'll say it again. The truth fears no question. And I'm very happy that he thinks that he can put the information forward, unlike the other woman who just claims it without providing any evidence. I want to see if he is going to provide some evidence. And then, of course, we're going to have to look at all the other places that provided science and poetry and all the other thing in the Islamic Golden Age, not the Islamic Golden Age of Science, in the Islamic Golden Age, and see if those people were all Persian too.
Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. This area was never included in any of the classical civilizations. If you look at the Persian Empire, for example, it ignored the Arabian Peninsula. The same is the case for the East Roman or Byzantine Empire and for the Egyptian Empire. It was not that these empires weren't able to include the Arabian Peninsula into their area of control, it was just that they weren't interested. They were
So let's start with what's not true. So the area that he circles as Arabia is obviously a little smaller than the real Arabia. So let's draw a map of actual Arabia. So this is Arabia, right? And you can see that it goes all the way to Iraq and obviously the Arabian areas. But that's only important because he cuts it off lower. And of course, the area called Saudi Arabia, you can see, is literally in that area that he sort of puts a cutoff to. Now, as far as people not being interested in Arabia in the past, this is far from true, because as you can see, as part of the list of people that are listed in the captured peoples of the Achaemenian, it's Arabs right at the bottom. These Arabs represent a people who are camel hunters and things like that. And these people were very difficult to penetrate. Now, there was a civilization of their own inside that entire region of Arabia. We don't need to get deep into it, but there was several civilizations in that region. And then there was the Sasanian Empire, which basically expanded Persian influence all the way till Yemen. So, of course, when we look at the Persian Empire, we can tell that before even the Sasanian Empire, there was influence in terms of the Persian Empire within the Arabian regions. Now, remember where I put the Arabian Peninsula. There you go. Now, just because they had a hard time conquering the Arabs, that does not mean that they were not interested in the Arabs. As you can see at Magan, they definitely came into Arab territory, and then, of course, the part of Saudi Arabia.
was nothing there, so to speak. Before Islam emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula, the regions of North Africa and much of the Middle East used to be part of the Christian world, where the Greek philosophical heritage was well known to the people. If you then look at Islam,
so, of course, before the invention of Islam, the biggest religion that existed in the Western world, I'm not talking about Europe, I'm just talking about anywhere west of Buddhism influence, was Christianity. And it affected North Africa, it affected East Africa, it affected Egypt, Arabia. All these places were affected by Christianity. Some of them, like the Himyarite kingdom, were Jewish. Now, of course, we have to be careful here because there were a lot of other religions in North Africa as well. Traditional African religion.
In the year 850, you can see that they basically conquered these geographical areas. Nowadays, when we think about Egypt, Syria or Central Asia, we view these areas as Islamic areas. But these areas really used to be areas of Greek heritage and Persian heritage. They used to be areas of great intellectual heritage and scientific work.
So again, we have to be careful about what he's saying here. He is basically saying that during the Greek empires extending with the Ptolemaics and stuff like that, there was an influence of Greek learning, which obviously came later. There was Persian learning, all of those things, which the Greeks learned from themselves. But there was an influence of Greek learning on some of these places. But let's see where he heads with it.
Talking about Islam and science, the first thing that needs to be emphasized is that in Islam, the law of cause and effect is not recognized. This is a very important detail about Islam because scientific thinking is based on the idea of cause and effect.
So obviously, Islam is not science. So this idea that it doesn't worship cause and effect doesn't make sense. It's not clashing with Islam. It's clashing with all religions, because all religions are beyond science. They're divine. And so even Christianity is beyond cause and effect. And everything, basically every religion goes beyond that, because everything is ultimately the work of God or gods or whatever.
People following an ideology that rejects cause and effect generally can't engage in science. In Islam there is no cause and effect because Allah can recreate the world any moment He desires. And
Again, this is Babel Babel, because the Christian God is exactly the same. He can recreate the world anytime he desires. In fact, we know this happened with the story of Noah, where he basically flooded the world and then put the animals back on again. So I don't understand why he's bringing this part up.
change the laws of nature. So there is no point in studying these, and doing so anyway is even considered by the stricter Muslims as an act of apostasy.
Yeah, I'm going to dismiss that point as nonsense. The idea that some people don't like science in Islam is not a good enough answer to say there were no Islamic scientists. I want to see that evidence that you made the claim of before. You said there was no Islamic scientists.
When Islam conquered the classical world, they burned most of the literature that they found. For example, when Islam conquered Alexandria in the year 640, they destroyed everything that they could find. The work of this very interesting and distinctive civilization, manuscripts about math, astronomy, and who knows what else, ended up being destroyed.
So what he's talking about here is the Library of Alexandria, and how we lost all this information due to the fact that, a Muslim king said this quote of, the things are not in line with the Quran, therefore burn him. There is no contemporary proof of this. There is no proof of anything. In fact, it's widely debunked now by historians, and they think the real reason why some of the things were lost in the Library of Alexandria is because they lost some, basically they documented, remade the important information and ignored some of the information they didn't care about. So if we read this real quick, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, some writers are still disposed to believe and even repeat the story of how great Library of Alexandria was destroyed by the Arabs after their conquest of the city in 642 AD by order of the Caliph Umar. The story, its origins, purpose, acceptance, and rejection provides an interesting example of how such historical myths arise and for a while at least flourish. The story first became known to Western scholarship in 1663 when Edward Pocock, the Laudian professor of Arabic of Oxford, published an edition of the Arabic texts with Latin translations of part of the compendious history of the dynasties of the Syrian Christian author Berherbarius, also known as Abu al-Faraj. According to the story, Amr ibn al-As, the commander of the Arab conquerors, was inclined to accept the pleas of John the grammarian and spare the library, but the Caliph decreed otherwise. If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, they are useless and need not be preserved. If books in the library, the story continues, were accordingly distributed among the 4,000 bathhouses of the city and used to heat the furnaces, which they kept going for almost 6 months, as early as the 1713, Father whatever, the distinguished French Orientalist, cast doubt on the story, remarking in his History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, published in that year, that it had something untrustworthy about it. Curiously, although Father, whatever text is in Latin, the word untrustworthy is in Greek, perhaps a security precaution. The great English historian Edward Gibbon, never one to miss a good story, relates to the gusto and then proceeds, for my own part, I am strongly tempted to deny both the facts. So I'm going to say this again. This story is not only suspect, it's just not true. The Arabs actually respected the information that was there, and it's later Arabs who, around 1000 AD onwards, started talking about mythological destruction done by an Arab, and in some cases, they even changed the library.
It means that we today do not have access to most of the intellectual work of the Egyptians because Islam destroyed it. They did.
So it's been known since the olden days that actually what he's saying is not even close to the truth. The Arabs were obsessed with ancient Egyptian culture. They were obsessed with the pyramids. They were obsessed with alchemy, which has to do with ancient Egyptian arts. They were obsessed with the magic, the religion. They were obsessed with everything that had to do with Egypt. This idea that they just hated it and just destroyed all these books, that's just some made up stuff, because of course people who don't like Islam, they trying to paint this picture.
And in colors, this colors, by the way, was one of the reasons why Muslims were interested in hieroglyphic, because in Islamic calligraphy, in Arabic calligraphy, you have the same beautiful harmony of letters, gracefulness, straightforward, colors, so vivid, the colors of Islamic calligraphy, the Arabic calligraphy. And this is exactly the kind of things that they would have found in hieroglyph. Look at the harmony of the stela. Stela to the right, a mirror image of that to the left, with the pharaoh's title in the middle. And this kind of harmony, Arabs were really impressed with, and it's one of the reasons why they took interest in ancient Egyptian language. As I said, they realized the link between Coptic of their days and ancient Egyptian, and they wrote grammars in Arabic of the Coptic language, the first grammar books of their kind ever, and they even wrote a dictionary, or several of them. I just have one. Here's a dictionary of Coptic, the Coptic word to the left, and the Arabic word to the right. Now, these are of great importance for the process of studying ancient Egyptian language in all its phases here in the West. And if it wasn't for these Arabs, then we would never have had that sort of advanced knowledge. Now, one final reason for why Arabs were interested in hieroglyphic, a very intriguing reason. They were looking for coding system. If you are writing diplomatic letters, you don't want them to fall in the wrong hands and be easily read. You want to write them in a strange script that nobody else except you and the person you are sending it to can read. And what is better than hieroglyphic? So among those who were interested in hieroglyphic issue were some people like Ibn Drahim, who wrote and used hieroglyphic as well for coding. Now, there is another reason. There is another reason for the interest of the Arabs. I came across a study that says why, when Iran became a Muslim country, the Iranians they adopted the new religion, but they kept their language. While in Egypt, they adopted both language and religion. And he gave the reason as follows. The Iranian were an ancient nation that's so proud of its own heritage that they wanted to keep their language. Does that mean that Egyptians were not interested in their own heritage? Hence, they didn't bother to keep their own language? It is quite the opposite. Well, not the opposite, but the fact is that Egyptian kept the same language because it was the same language. It was just written in a different script, like Turkish nowadays. Turkish used to be written in Arabic. Now it's written in Latin alphabet. Did it change it as a language? It didn't. It's just a script. So Egyptian moved from hieroglyphic to Coptic, which was actually written in Greek alphabet. It wasn't even written in ancient Egypt.
So the Arabs are not the only source that we have, that the Arabs had entered the pyramids and searched for ancient records and stuff like that and looked through ancient Egyptian writings as opposed to what these guys are saying, where they believe that they just abandoned it and burned everything and were all about destruction. We know this from Egyptologists that first entered some of the pyramids. Khafre's pyramid, for example, that was entered by an Egyptologist, he found Arabic graffiti inside, meaning that he was not the first person to enter.
However, Belzoni knew, better than any other, that he was not the first discoverer, and that the pyramid had been opened and then resealed long before his time, probably in about 1200. In fact, he found a number of phrases written in charcoal on the wall, in Arabic script. For example, quote, Mohammed Ahmed, quarryman, opened this with the assistance of Othman and the consent of King Ali Muhammad, from the beginning to the end.
The people who want to dream that the Islamic world from Africa, Asia, and to Europe were obsessed with the idea of destruction can dream on. And as one of the people, Finkel, today has said, without the Arabic understanding that Coptic was just another version of ancient Egyptian, there would have been no translation by the Europeans later. That's why they started learning, those scholars, in order to translate Egyptian, started learning Arabic, and they started learning the Coptic language. They did this in order so that they could retranslate the ancient Egyptian writings. I know the general story is that they saw the Rosetta Stone and then all was well, but that's not how it worked.
The same to other important centers of intellectual heritage. Who today has ever heard about the work of the Nestorian Christians or about the work of the Chaldean Christians? Later, when Islam conquered the Indian peninsula, they did the same there as well. The largest library on the Indian subcontinent was the Library of Alanda. It got
So on this side, there is a half-truth. It is true that a Muslim, a Turkish Muslim, did destroy Nalanda University, which happened to have a library and had a lot of information destroyed within that library. But it's not true that this was the work of one Muslim. What really happened was this area was an attack point for foreign people, and previous Indian scholars from the 7th century and other times had attacked the library as well. King Shashanka of the Gaudu Empire did this as well. Now, I love Nalanda University because it connects the East and the West. In fact, a scholar from China went there and wrote one of the best books in history, A Journey to the West, where he went to India. And then that eventually became one of my favorite cartoons growing up, Dragon Ball Z, through the Monkey King, which was based on A Journey to the West.
Completely burned down. The Islamic modus operandi related to the literature that they found was basically as follows. If it is something that is not written in the Quran, destroy it, because it means that it is not important. Because if it were important, it would have been written in the Quran. If it is something that can also be found in the Quran, destroy it, because we already have it anyway, because it's in the Quran. This way of reasoning basically means burn all the writings of non-Islamic cultures that you can get your hands on.
So this quote that he's getting is from that false story that has been told over and over again by people. That's where he's getting this quote from. And the proof here is, this might look like a random Arabic text, but it's a translation, an Arabic translation of Galen. Galen, medical knowledge, which the Arabs used everywhere, including the Swahili coast, including, not the Arabs, but the Muslims used it, including in the Swahili coast, including in Egypt, including in Iran, including everywhere.
Yet, activists like Mehdi Hassan often claim the following.
Crucible points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe.
Okay, so I've basically debunked everything he said over there. I want to see what other evidence does he provide for his claims.
So let's discuss these Islamic philosophers that are mentioned by Mehdi Hassan and by people similar to him. The regions that Islam conquered were filled with some of the remains of the classical civilizations, and many of the peoples that were forced to convert to Islam were people who previously belonged to these classical civilizations. So of course within this large region there were people who were interested in studying their own classical civilizations.
So again, here we're taught a half-truth. He boxes in that area and says these people are interested in studying their own historical civilization. But let's be honest, that's not their own historical civilization they studied. They studied all the intellectual stuff from other civilizations, including their own. This is different than just looking into your own civilization.
Generally speaking, they weren't really allowed to do so, but there were certain shorter time periods within certain smaller regions, often created by certain rulers in these regions, when there was a bit more tolerance towards those who wanted to study the classical works.
So that's a pretty bold claim, and I'd love to see if he's going to throw any evidence to prove that they were not allowed to do any of this stuff. As far as I know, not only were they allowed, they were encouraged and funded.
Mehdi Hassan just mentioned Ibn Rushd. He was a man who was very interested in the Greek heritage and especially in Aristotle. Ibn Rushd lived in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, during a time when the local ruler was Abu Yaqub Yusuf, a Muslim ruler who also happened to be interested in Greek philosophy. Ibn Rushd wanted to open Islam up to rational criticism and make Islam more in accordance with the work of Aristotle. Now, to many Westerners today, this would immediately prove that Islam and science do get along. This isn't the case, however. To get an idea of the type of beliefs that Ibn Rushd had, here are some quotes from him. The world is divided in men with humor and no religion, and men with religion and no humor. And women must be treated as human beings and not as pets. These type of statements are not in accordance with Islam at all.
So ignoring how everybody looks over here, which they would have looked very differently because of course they come from North Africa at a specific location, but let's not even get into that. Averroes and Ibn Rushd are the same person. Averroes is the European way of saying Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd not only was a Muslim, but he was a Muslim apologist amongst atheists. So in other words, while other people were leaving Islam and while other people were arguing for or against Islam, Ibn Rushd was the opposite of that. He was an apologist. In other words, he wrote the book on the harmony of religion and philosophy. In other words, Aristotelian philosophy. He tried to bring them together and say that they're actually compatible. You don't have to stop being a Muslim to believe in reason. That's Ibn Rushd. So, as I said, while others were arguing for the separation of religion and reasonable thought, Ibn Rushd went out of his way to try and glue these together because he did not want to run away from Islam in order to be considered reasonable. And he didn't want to be a heretic as well. The thing that he said is, to master the instrument, the religious thinker must make a preliminary study of logic, just as the lawyer must study legal reasoning. This is no more heretical in the one case than the other, and logic must be learned from the ancient masters, regardless of the fact that they were not Muslims. The law then has urged us to have demonstrative knowledge of God, the Exalted, and all the beings of his creation, but it is preferable and even necessary for anyone who wants to understand God the Exalted and the other beings demonstratively to have first understood the kinds of demonstrations and their conditions of validity, and in what respect demonstrative reasoning differs from dialectical, rhetorical, and fallacious reasoning. But this is not possible unless he has previously learned what reasoning as such is, and how many kinds it has, and which of them are valid. So, in other words, he's not running away from God. In fact, he's a big champion of God, the Islamic God. But I'll get back to that. I want to see what other false narratives is he going to push about Ibn Rushd.
So Ibn Rushd ended up being prosecuted, and most of the literature that he created ended up being burned. A small part of his work that didn't get burned ended up in the hands of European thinkers, who got to know Ibn Rushd as Averroes, which is basically a Latin version of his name, and who spoke about the man very positively. His work ended up in the hands of Jacob Anatoli, the French Jewish philosopher and translator. He translated Averroes' work from Arabic into Hebrew, which then ended up influencing Jewish philosophy through the work of Maimonides in the 12th century. In addition, Italian philosopher Thomas Aquinas ended up being influenced by the work of Aristotle, which became available to the people in Europe from the year 1140 onward through the translations that were made possible thanks to people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina.
So again, half-truths are being told here. The books of Averroes that were burnt are not the ones on science and things like that. They are instead these books of apology, these books that try to mix religion with reason, instead of the other people who separated reason from religion. As you can see here, if we continue reading, since all this is now established, and since we are the Muslim community, hold that the divine religion of ours is true, and that it is this religion which incites and summons us to the happiness that consists to our knowledge of God mighty and majestic, and his creation, that end is appointed for every Muslim by the method of ascent which his temperament and nature require, for the natures of men are on different levels with respect to their paths to ascent. One of them comes to ascent through demonstration, other comes to ascent through dialecticals, arguments, just as firmly as demonstrative man through demonstrations, since his nature does not contain any greater capacity, while another comes to assent through rhetorical arguments, again just as firmly as the demonstrative man through demonstrative arguments. Thus, since the divine religion of ours has summoned people by these three methods, assent to he has extended to everyone except him who stubbornly denies it in the tongue, or him for whom no method of summons to God the Exalted has been appointed in religion, owing to his own. By the way, what I'm about to read is something that is very typical in the texts of Al-Andalus. There's always a mention of black people and white people in Al-Andalus. Averroes, who comes from Arabia and ends up here, is going to mention black people, as they always do. So we were here. God the Exalted has been appointed in religion owing to his own neglect of such matters. It was for this purpose that the prophet, peace be upon him, was sent with a special mission to the white man and the black man alike. I mean, because his religion embraces all the methods of summons to God the Exalted. This is clearly expressed in the saying of God the Exalted, "Summon to the way of your Lord by wisdom and by good preaching, and debate with them in the most effective manner. Now, you might be thinking, what does being black have to do with anything? Well, he's making two claims here which go against what this guy is saying. One, he's making it quite clear that reason is something and religion is something that is available to both black people and white people, which goes against the idea that it had to do with these personal foundations. So whatever background he comes from, that's just the limit of where he's coming from. That is not a fact. If we read from the last four paragraphs, starting at the full stop or the period, in this matter only, the negation of existence is unbelief, because it concerns one of the principles of religion and one of those points to which assent is attainable through the three methods common to the white man and the black man. So let's go back to the half-truth that he's speaking. So the half-truth that he's speaking is the idea that they burned all his scientific books. No, they didn't. What they burned was the books that were trying to mix science with religion. The people wanted to separate these two and see them as two separate things. They kept his scientific books. They kept his medicine books. They kept all his books that had to do with proper care. They just burnt the ones that had to do with this harmony of religion and reason. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. They burned it the first time they read it. No. This was pressure that came from extreme Muslims of the day who were basically arguing that this book was heretical, but a lot of people had already purchased and used that. This is how it ended up in Europe, because a lot of copies had already existed of this one book. By the way, this is the second book that I've read from Andalusia, and you will notice that Andalusians tend to mention black people a lot, even if the thing has nothing to do with black people.
This caused the Europeans to wrongly associate the Greek heritage with the Islamic world, a misconception that wasn't corrected until much later.
So again, this person is lying, and I hate to say that, but it's true, because here's another part where Ibn Rushd mentions another black person, and you can see in the way that he talks about it that he's a firm believer of Islam. If this is established, it will have become clear to you from the scripture, from we have said that there are apparent texts of scripture which it is not permitted to interpret allegorically. To do so on fundamentals is unbelief, on subordinate matters, heresy. There are also apparent texts which have to be interpreted allegorically by men of the demonstrative class. For such men to take them in their apparent meaning is unbelief, while for those who are not of the demonstrative class to interpret them allegorically and take them out of their apparent meaning is unbelief or heresy on their part. Of this latter class are the verse about God's directing himself and the tradition about his descent. That is why the Prophet, peace on him, said in the case of the black woman, when she told him that God was in the sky, "Free her, for she is a believer." This was because she was not of the demonstrative class, and the reason for his decision was that the class of people to whom assent comes only through the imagination, who do not assent to a thing except in so far as they can imagine it, find it difficult to assent to the existence of a being which is unrelated to any imaginable thing. This applies as well to those who understand from the relation stated merely that God has a place. These are people who have advanced a little in their thought beyond the position of the first class by rejecting belief in corporeality. Thus, the proper answer to them with regard to such passages is that they belong to ambiguous texts, and that the stop is to be placed after the words of God the Exalted, and no one knows the interpretation thereof except God. The demonstrative class, while agreeing and unanimously that this class of text must be interpreted allegorically, may disagree about the interpretation according to the level of each one's knowledge of demonstration. There is also a third class of scriptural texts falling uncertainly between the other two classes, on which there is doubt. Again, arguing that this person is not a Muslim and did not do what he did because of Islam is neglecting his own words.
I just mentioned the name Ibn Sina. This is another philosopher that is often mentioned by Muslim activists. He was a child prodigy who was born in the year 980 in the area that we now know as Uzbekistan. During that time period, that area was a part of the Samanid dynasty, a Persian dynasty located in Central Asia. The Samanid dynasty lasted from 819 to 999 and was famous for maintaining their Persian intellectual heritage, despite them being conquered by Islam and being forced to live as Muslims. Ibn Sina had memorized the entire Quran by the age of 10, but not much later he started to learn Indian mathematics and became fascinated by a traveling scholar who was able to cure the sick. As a teenager he studied Aristotle, which he had access to thanks to the commentaries written by Al-Farabi.
So this one is even worse than before, because Avicenna, as he just mentioned, had learned the Quran at a very young age. And so he is not someone that you can claim was not a Muslim. He most certainly was a Muslim. And even though this was based on what was happening in Islam, in the Islamic world at the time, you can see how big the gap is between these areas. Al-Andalus and Uzbekistan, as he mentioned, these places are very far away from each other. And so them having the same tradition at the same time, there's no glue outside of Islam. By the way, Ibn Sina wrote a book that that was literally trying to prove the existence of God. The book is literally called Proof of the Truthful. Proof of the Truthful, Proof of the Veracious, among others, is a formal argument for proving the existence of God introduced by the Islamic philosopher Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina. He argued that there must be a necessary existence, an entity that cannot exist. The argument says that the entire set of contingent things must have a cause that is not contingent, because otherwise it would be included in the set. Furthermore, through a series of arguments, he derived that the necessary existence must have attributes that he identified with the God in Islam, including unity, simplicity, immateriality, intellectual power, generosity, and goodness. That's the guy he's bringing up.
Another Muslim translator of Aristotle's work. Ibn Sina's fascination with medicine motivated him to make a great contribution to the area of medicine. His work ended up in Europe, where he became known as Avicenna. Because of his fascination with scientific thinking, he was a controversial figure in his own time period, as he was often referred to as a kafir by the more devout Muslims. But because of his medical talents, he was quite useful to have around for local rulers rulers during their times of bad health.
That's a beautiful story, sir, but it lacks proof, so we throw it in the trash.
Mehdi Hassan also mentioned Al-Khwarizmi, who is often claimed to be the founder of algebra. Just like Ibn Sina, he too came from the Persian tradition and studied Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics. His work ended up in Europe, which basically led to the word algebra. And
So again, he's trying to speed through these people so that we don't have time to slow down and check it out. So this is a quote by Al-Khwarizmi, who says that it is because of God that he's doing maths, that fondness for science, that affability and condensation which God shows to the learned, that promptitude with which he protects and supports them in the elucidation of obscurities and in the removal of difficulties, has encouraged me to compose a short work on calculating by al-Jabr, this is where the word algebra comes from, and al-Makubala, confining it to what is easiest and most useful in arithmetic. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. So in other words, al-Khwarizmi literally wrote this book in praise of his God, saying that maths exists because of God. The Islamic God, by the way.
another person who is often mentioned by Muslim activists is Ibn Khaldun, a historian and sociologist who studied social cohesion and tribalism. He too was a fan of the Greek intellectual heritage, and his work on the rise and fall of civilization ended up in the hands of Ottoman historians, who used his theories to examine the progress and the failures of their own Ottoman Empire.
So we've talked about the Muqaddimah written by Ibn Khaldun, and in there he clearly shows that he believes in the religion of Islam. And remember, he's the guy who debunks the Shem, Ham, and Japheth thing, saying that in no place does it say that the descendants of Ham are going to become black and become slaves and all of that. He's the one who debunks it early in Islam. Another fact about the Muqaddimah is that it's filled with religious writing all over it. And then there's other books by Ibn Khaldun which are about religion. Again, the lie that is told by some Persians especially, but also Europeans, is trying to remove any part of Islam in this by saying that they arc back to a history. And it's true that during the golden age of Islam, they didn't just invent everything there and then. The smart thing they did was the translation movement. They learned from other cultures.
Now, of course, intellectual work is always based on previous work of other people.
So why did you waste our time going through this whole thing just to tell us that work is based on previous people? We all know this.
For example, if we take Thomas Aquinas, we can say that the lines of influence could be as follows. Of course, this is ignoring other influences to Thomas Aquinas that are not Ibn Rushd. But based on something like this, Muslim activists like Mehdi Hassan like to call Ibn Rushd the father of the European Renaissance, or the father of the European Enlightenment even. This is extremely disproportionate, because no single person can be called the father of any of these time periods.
Well, it might be an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration that Europeans are not afraid to use. I mean, don't they call Shakespeare the father of modern literature, and then they call one of these other people the father of music, and then they call the other person these guys love the father of this and that, even though there's many people who contributed to any of these subjects.
The European Renaissance started from the Italian independent city-states, after scholars from the Byzantine Empire had to flee from the Turks and ended up in Italy, and none of these Byzantine scholars has ever been referred to as the father of anything. In addition, if we were to expand these lines of influence further, it would look as follows. So is Aristotle now the father of the Renaissance and of the Enlightenment?
So I know you probably don't know this, but Aristotle is called the father of philosophy and science, at least Western philosophy and science.
Expand this picture even further and further. The so-called Golden Age of Islamic science can better be described as a period when a handful of individuals were translating some of the Greek work into Arabic and were interested in studying Indian mathematics. It can better be described as the final breath of the classical civilizations after the Muslims destroyed it.
So of course he's dead wrong here, because the Islamic Golden Age was not just about science. That's why he added that. He wanted to put that in there for some weird reason. The Islamic Golden Age had to do with religion. It had to do with science, philosophy, geography, anthropology, biology, poetry, music, art, painting, architecture, and so many more other things that we can throw in there. It's odd that he goes out of his way to try and narrow it to just this one thing, like a handful of scientists. No. How about a whole bunch of people who were disconnected? And then, of course, you can go to manufacturers, people who weren't necessarily scholars, but were building things, glass makers, soap makers, whatever, pick something, sugar planters.
Or the sad aftermath of Greek, Persian and Indian science, or something like that. Calling it the golden age of anything is quite disrespectful towards those civilizations whose work got destroyed by Islam. In addition,
Anyone's work who got destroyed is obviously a terrible thing, but no religion is free from that. A lot of religions destroyed other people's texts, especially those that are still around today in the Judeo world.
this handful of individuals were doing what they were doing despite of Islam and not thanks to Islam. And we are basically continuing other philosophical traditions than Islam. If you look for example at the number of Dutch thinkers during the Dutch Golden Age, you can already see a list of individuals that is much longer than this handful of Islamic individuals. And
by the way, this is just a list of names of astronomers in the Golden Age of Islam. More astronomers, you can see how many there are because astronomy was big. Now chemists and alchemists, economists and social studies, geographers and earth scientists, mathematicians. These are all mathematicians. And then you get to philosophers right at the bottom. Then you get to physicists and engineers. This handful is a lie.
this is just the Netherlands, a piece of land less than half the size of Jordan. So let's not even begin to discuss the contributions of thinkers from Italy, France, England and Germany. In addition, there is another important difference between these individuals in the Islamic world and the thinkers in Europe. The thinkers in the Islamic world didn't end up influencing Islamic culture.
So again, he's a lying piece. Okay, he's a liar because Islamic writing from that period, especially the hadiths, had great impact on the Islamic world after that. This guy is making stuff up and for no reason.
Islam wouldn't have been such a rigid ideology, people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina could have been the Enlightenment thinkers of the Islamic world. However, they didn't, and their work has been forgotten by the Muslim world.
So first of all, their work was not forgotten by the Islamic world, as most of these things were coming from the Islamic world and were taught in the Islamic countries. It's just that there's a lot of destabilization, a lot of extremists, and a lot of whatever, which change things. And of course, the fortunes change. The Europeans picked up where the Arabs left off. Not the Arabs, the Muslims.
Like the work of the Coptic and the Nestorian Christians. In Europe, the philosophers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment actually ended up influencing the European mind, which we today know as the Western mind. The influence from the church was pushed back as a result, and the Western people who today call themselves Christians can better be described as Greco-Roman Enlightenment followers or something like that. It is just that it sounds kinda weird.
It's weird because it ignores all the other cultures that have poured into their culture. We all know that the type of democracy that they have in America, for example, and other places in the West, is not the same type that they had in the Greco-Roman world. It's the type they had in the Americas. The influence of several different nations have contributed to what they call Western civilization. And even in their writings, they write about how they use personal justifications, so Western words, in order to justify things. I even talked about a French scholar who came to Africa and justified the naturalness of democracy because he saw it amongst the Tuareg.
It is important to realize that the Muslims conquered peoples and regions who had a very rich tradition of intellect. The Persians that got conquered and forced to become Muslims had philosophical traditions that were much older than Islam itself. Zoroastrianism was a very science-minded ideology. Now imagine that in the year 2080, the French will have been forced to convert to Islam, and a few years later, a native French man who is considered to be an apostate by the Muslims there invents a cold fusion reactor and revolutionizes the world in the area of sustainable energy. After that, an imam puts a fatwa on his head, he gets beaten up in the streets, and then he dies. Now what would you then think about a Muslim activist who then goes to China in the year 2180 to claim that a great Islamic scientist invented the first cold fusion reactor? This wouldn't be a fair depiction of reality at all. However,
that would not be a fair depiction at all if that same scientist did not spend years of his life writing books defending Islam. Now imagine the exact same scientist who does cold fusion. Imagine that same scientist decides that he's going to spend years of his life writing about how awesome God is and why he gave him the ability to invent that. And then we come in the future and say, well, no, that's not real because we don't like it.
This is quite similar to what Mehdi Hassan and other activists like him are doing systematically to manipulate Western audiences.
A man named Al-Khawarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who...
Thanks for having the patience to watch this rather long video.
Thanks for doing little to no research so that your information is easy to debunk. And by the way, saying a handful of scholars and showing 5 people and calling that the entirety of the Islamic Golden Age shows me that you literally did no research whatsoever. What about the Bana Musa brothers? Come on. Do more research, buddy.
Let's make one final point. One might argue that if you want to study history, you should kind of forget about the present. But a very strong point about Islam and scientific thinking can also be made just by looking at our present world, consisting of 7.7 billion people in 2019. Consider this: if Islam truly had a scientific tradition within it, or if Islam wouldn't be a rigid anti-scientific ideology, then the economic recovery and population growth within Islamic countries would have meant a return of this Islamic scientific thinking.
Right. In the same way that Christianity was against science and scientific thinking for a long time too, right? That should not happen. If that stop, stop. Religion is different than science. We know that the Islamic Golden Age, that was both fueled by the religion and fueled by the scientific traditions, is something that at the time was going hand in hand, and they had to justify it. That's what necessarily makes it go hand in hand. If they just separated both of them and said there's nothing together in any of these at all, and you're not allowed to practice it, though people that you're saying did it in spite of, they would have not done it at all.
China has had a very bad 19th and 20th century, referred to by the Chinese themselves as the Age of Humiliation. Today, China is recovering, and together with this we can see the return of Chinese scientists. The same is the case for India. The Indians have a tradition of philosophy. The Hindus got conquered by the Muslims and later colonized by the British. The Muslims are now living in Pakistan and Bangladesh. By far most people living in India are not Muslims. And now that this region is growing economically, we are also seeing the return of Indians engaging in science.
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up. You know what those places that you just mentioned also have in common that could have caused that stagnation? Look at this map and you will find out.
This wouldn't have been the case if the Hindus were followers of an anti-scientific ideology. In that case, India would have been much more similar to Pakistan and Bangladesh, where the people are not engaging in science as much at all. Now let's
Or India and China are large regions and they can actually reform things like that because they're basically subcontinents on their own with very large populations. Like Russia is another example. Under the Soviets, they had a lot of success in science.
compare China and India to Indonesia, which is a country of 264 million people, and ask yourself, where are all the scientists and thinkers? Why
So compare 2.5 million people to 2 billion.
are India and China creating innovation, but Indonesia isn't? Modern day Egypt is a Muslim country of nearly 100 million people. Where is all the innovation? Where are all the scientific centers solving the African water problem? They're not there. Meanwhile, Israel, a country of only 9 million people, is working to solve the African water problem.
First of all, Egypt was one of the biggest contributors, even in the later years of Islam, in terms of invention and things like that, engineering in those areas. And secondly, again, look at what they all have in common. Crushing.
And is contributing to science and human progress more than 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide, a country just a fourth of the size of Jordan. The country Morocco today is not in a bad state because of the warm and dry weather. It is in such a bad state because of Islam. So,
Or colonization, or any other things. I don't know. Some of the other things could play a role.
people like Mehdi Hassan claim that Islam made a contribution to science. I'd say that individuals interested in Greek, Persian and Indian science passed on a very small amount of what was left of the classical civilization to the Europeans. I'd say that if Islam would not have existed, that these classical civilizations would have been able to produce much more scientific advancement. Thanks for watching this video and I wish you a pleasant day.
Thoroughly debunked. What you're saying is all nonsense, speculation. If Islam didn't exist, there wouldn't have been the direct connection between Al-Andalus and all these other nations you're talking about. How would the Indian mathematics have made its way all the way to Africa? Playing games, talking nonsense.